Hello, and welcome to the webinar on dynamic implementation. The goal of this webinar is to introduce you to the best practices for effective implementation. So let's jump right in. I would like to start with the idea that organizations and systems are perfectly designed to achieve the outcomes that they get. Now, let's think about this statement for just a moment. If you take a look at your outcomes, those are perfect reflections or perfect shadows of what's happening in your organization. Whatever's happening in your organization at the culture level, the leadership level, and the way that we implement, and our habits, and our practices are perfectly driving our results. Which part of this statement rings true in your experience? What organizational structures, policies, habits, and cultures create results that you or your team may or may not even be aware of? Shining a light on some of these invisible forces that impact organizational outcomes is the topic of today's presentation, what we call implementation science. In its most basic form, implementation means to try or use something new. This is why we use implementation as a verb, not a noun, to describe the dynamic activities and the process of implementation that create the conditions and support necessary to do something new. Because implementing new things requires changing something that we're doing, and because we're humans and change can be difficult, implementation efforts can go off the rails when we're not intentional and do not expect the real challenges that come from asking people to change the way that they do things. Implementation science is about the activities that we can do on purpose to be intentional about implementation and not leave our outcomes to chance. Typically, when we go to implement something, whether it be a new program, practice, policy, or strategy, we spend a lot of time on the front end planning. And when the plan goes into action, all types of real-world forces come into play, which we may not have anticipated or planned for. Leadership changes, employee turnover, resource limitations, staff or stakeholder resistance, competing priorities, or even pandemics. Implementation science strives to understand the elements and conditions that ensure effective practices are successfully carried out in real life with real impact on real people. This cartoon highlights that implementation is not about what we're doing, but about how we're doing it, how we operationalize good practices to see the outcomes that we expect. In this cartoon, you see two gentlemen talking. There's a gobbledygook math equation on the left that represents our innovation or our best practices, and there's another gibberish math equation on the right that represents our outcomes or our results. Then in the middle, you see that we're expecting a miracle to happen. That miracle represents how most organizations implement change. The idea here is that we have to be more specific and intentional in how we implement change. Crossing your fingers and hoping for a miracle won't get you far. Intentional implementation is most often the difference between organizations that flourish and those that fizzle. Understanding which parts of your program have the most impact, why it works, and how it's operating is critical when you want to innovate, grow, and show outcomes. To provide consistent positive outcomes over time, organizations must be focused on how they're implementing their programs and services in the communities that they serve. From hiring the right people, to building a management team that supports coaching and feedback, and using data to make decisions, the organizational leadership must be paying attention to the actual implementation of the program or innovation itself. Here's what we know from the research. Implementation is hard, and change, generally speaking, fails at a very high rate. Regardless of whether the change is coming from the top down, such as mandates, legislation, or top-down leadership directives, grassroots change from the bottom up, or through critical mass, this data collected by Harvard demonstrates a 70% failure rate. This means that most of our best efforts do not work as we intend, and the results can be burnout, staff disengagement, and cynicism that nothing works to make real change. People-dependent change efforts have an even higher failure rate. In fact, 80 to 90% of change efforts never get fully implemented. These new programs and efforts are unlikely to show long-term outcomes for people because they were actually never fully implemented to begin with. We try a lot of different strategies when we go to implement something new. Maybe we disseminate information through emails and messaging campaigns. Perhaps we launch new training so staff and stakeholders can learn about the new project or initiative. Maybe policymakers pass new legislation to mandate new practices and change initiatives. Maybe new grant funding becomes available to try new initiatives to solve complex problems. Or organizational growth requires a reorganization to make room for more change. While all of these strategies are well-intended, on their own, these methods only affect long-term change 5 to 15% of the time. Rather than leaving implementation to chance, implementation science provides a roadmap to increase the odds that we achieve the outcomes that we're after. Oftentimes, well-intentioned efforts and people struggle with competing priorities, multiple funding streams, grant requirements, and heavy workloads that can create an environment where we're speeding along to the next thing before we even finish the first. Implementation takes time, focus, and intentionality. Different stages of the process require different activities. Understanding that implementation is a process allows you to anticipate and prevent issues which predictably arise. Let's take a look at the stages of implementation that can take 5 to 7 years of intentional effort to reach sustainability. The first stage is exploration, a stage where an organization spends time studying the extent to which the new thing fits with the organizational goals, values, and culture. This process can be skipped by many organizations if the innovation is mandated by legislation or driven by grants, funding, or other trends. In the installation stage, organizations begin technically implementing a new process. This stage begins when the decision to move ahead has occurred. Here, a new process exists because we say it does. Without intentional effort, it doesn't necessarily mean that anything has actually changed in practice. It's also easy to overlook this stage because it requires building staff competencies in new areas, identifying and removing barriers that may emerge when doing something new, like conflicting policies, practices, and values. During initial implementation, people start using the new thing in practice, and with this comes the need for intensive coaching and feedback to help people navigate the discomfort of growth and change. To successfully move through this stage, organizations must be doing things on purpose to quickly identify problems as they emerge, develop feedback loops and strategies to promote continuous improvement, manage the pace of the implementation and staff engagement as people struggle with learning and status quo is challenged. Most organizations never make it out of this stage. People get distracted by other priorities, and usually efforts halt here before they look at or measure quality and fidelity to the model itself. In full implementation, the new thing becomes the thing that you do. And as people skillfully implement the new practice, organizations begin to see the outcomes are achieved. Once people develop mastery, they can innovate on the model, identify the most impactful activities to scale effectively, and develop efficiencies. Most times we never make it out of installation or initial implementation before decision makers or grantors begin to evaluate program effectiveness. This creates problems because we're looking for outcomes from programs or models that are not operationalized into practice in the first place. This can lead to throwing out new models and strategies as not working before they've even really been implemented. Now, let's take a look at some of the consequences of failed implementations. This graph measures federal spending on K-12 education from 1966 to 2004. The vertical bars represent the amount of money put into the K-12 education system, and the blue line represents the change in reading scores for elementary and secondary school students. This startling data illustrates how decades of spending had zero results in terms of outcomes and benefits for students, and demonstrates how just throwing money at a system does not impact outcomes. So, why focus on purposeful and dynamic implementation? A meta analysis spanning 2 decades showed that interventions delivered without an explicit implementation focus took 17 years on average to reach full implementation, where the intervention was delivered as intended. And only 14% of the innovations reviewed were able to demonstrate being fully implemented as intended. Research by the National Implementation Research Network on the impact of quality programs has shown that without a focus on implementation best practices, outcomes may not be achieved as expected, and in some cases may even produce harmful results. When you sum it all up, even the most effective and research-driven practices, if implemented ineffectively, will produce inconsistent, unsustainable outcomes, and in most cases, the outcomes will be poor. You must have both an effective practice and an effective implementation strategy to get good outcomes. Think back in your own career to a time when you implemented something new, a new program or a new initiative. What worked in implementing that project? Or what challenged that project to eventually fizzle, fade, or even fail? Were the right people working on the project? And did they have the necessary skills, support, and resources to do the job? How did leadership keep staff focused on the goals? And how were challenges communicated from staff and addressed by leaders? How was data used to measure your progress and the effectiveness of your program? What kind of feedback loops were in place to solve problems, check in on progress, and improve the quality of services and processes? And how did the new program align with other organizational goals? Did it fit in with the overall mission and priorities of the organization? It's common that we can look back in our careers and think of examples of well-intentioned projects or programs that never quite took off. Maybe they didn't have the resources, support, or staff to become sustainable. Or maybe there were too many competing priorities in the organization, which redirected time and energy, or made it challenging to get buy-in from others. Some programs start strong, but then fizzle out or drift far from the original program model or goals. We call this lens the 5 dynamics of effective implementation. Each dynamic distilled down from years of research on what actually happens when organizations attempt to implement new ideas into the real world. The dynamics include people, data, culture, leadership, and feedback, and they emerge as critical to the adoption, use, and sustainment of new programs and innovations. Using the 5 dynamics can help us ask the right questions to ensure that we're solving the right problems when implementation gets tricky, leveraging our strengths, and planning ahead for any struggles. Let's start with people. Implementing new things often requires people to change what they're doing, how they see an issue, how they approach their day-to-day work, or maybe stretch their thoughts and beliefs about an issue. While change can be exhilarating if you're leading it, it can feel pretty exhausting if you perceive that it's happening to you. It can also involve feelings of loss of mastery over the way you've always done things, loss of competency as new initiatives require new skill sets, or loss of relevance, that our roles and jobs may not be as meaningful in this new context. For all of these reasons, if you can only focus on one thing, your people are worth your time, resources, and energy. The people dynamic requires us to think, to what degree are the right people working on the project? What's required of staff who are charged with implementing this new program? What skills are required to do the work? What sorts of relationships do they need to build? What actions do they need to carry out? And what decisions do they need to make? What mindset do they need to bring to the work? And what type of support does the organization need to provide for staff to be successful in the new ways that they work? All of these questions are important considerations when approaching your staff selection, hiring, onboarding, and staff development from an implementation perspective. Because changing the way that people do work is hard, it's important to be intentional about who we select and hire to accomplish the outcomes that we desire in the future. This means being thoughtful that the people are aligned with the organization's mission and values and have the mindsets and habits that we need to reflect the future state that we're aiming for. Onboarding is predictive of staff engagement and retention. It can be powerful to create belonging and purpose, or it can undo everything in your interview process by showing people that this is how it really is around here. Have you ever started a job really excited and then on your first day you were told to shadow a veteran employee who was burnt out, cynical, or maybe even disengaged? How did that impact your experience with your new position and the vision for your work? What implicit messages are sent about what's important, the way things work, and the organizational culture? All organizations face common challenges when it comes to onboarding. Many organizations don't have any formal onboarding process to begin with. They find themselves just winging it, or maybe providing a manual or a binder of policies and procedures and letting the new hire loose. Others may unintentionally be sending the wrong message by onboarding practices, such as shadowing a senior staff, who may have bad habits or attitudes that set the wrong tone. Another pitfall is just training and onboarding the wrong content. Maybe the majority of the job requires talking to people, yet onboarding is exclusively about writing reports and data entry, rather than communication expectations and strategies. Beyond hiring and onboarding, the people dynamic also attends to the ongoing training, coaching, and development of employees. This includes how we integrate performance feedback into our development process, who we're selecting to promote into leadership roles, and how we support them to be successful. Think through your own hiring and selection process. What are the qualities that are hard to teach that will make someone successful in the position and organization? Let's say you need employees who are open to receiving feedback and are coachable. How would you screen and assess for that quality? How could you use behavioral interview questions, skill demonstrations, and real-world experience to observe and assess the right match for your organization? Further, what feedback loops do you have in place to measure the degree to which your hiring processes are getting you the people that you need? Do you complete exit interviews? Do you regularly get feedback from your new hires and hiring managers to improve the process? Who might you be excluding, even unintentionally, from your recruitment and hiring process? All of these considerations are the work of the people dynamic in implementation. The next implementation dynamic is data. Data is something that we can be saturated in. We can have data overwhelm, and it matters what we're measuring. Are we just widget counting outputs and checking boxes, or are we collecting meaningful data that can tell us about quality measures, how things are happening in practice to give us information on how we can get better at doing what we're doing? Implementation data should provide feedback and improve the quality of service delivery. It should ask, to what extent are things happening the way that we intend? And this is about fidelity, an important metric that helps to paint a picture of how impactful our implementation is itself. Fidelity refers to the degree of match between the program model or curriculum design and what actually happens when delivered in practice. When starting new programs, it's common that over time, people and organizations begin to adapt the program to fit their needs and structure. Understanding what parts of a program work and what parts do not can help an organization understand which components they can adapt and which they need to stick to with fidelity. Understanding these non-negotiables in a program can inform how to train and coach staff, what to scale and replicate, what to stop doing, and how to improve and innovate. Let's check out an example of why fidelity matters. In this example, Washington State funded an innovation called Functional Family Therapy, or FFT for short, in 25 sites throughout the state, and found a 22% recidivism rate for those sites that used FFT. However, upon closer analysis, when they sorted the 25 sites into those that met and did not meet criteria for fidelity, they found different outcomes. The 12 sites that reached fidelity markers had a 13% recidivism rate, and those that did not meet fidelity markers had a 28% recidivism rate, more than double the recidivism. The 22% recidivism marker was the overall average and was pulled up by the programs that did not do FFT well. The point is, the fidelity matters. It's not just what program you're using that impact results. It's how well you implement the program in practice. And it's not enough to say that you're implementing FFT, but that you have implemented it with high quality, which means that you have to measure, track, and make decisions based upon quality and fidelity data. Fidelity is an important piece of the implementation puzzle. We often don't get to fidelity before we throw out the innovation and start trying something new. Let's consider the 3 elements to implementation fidelity: time, density, and quality. With time, we have to do things for a certain amount of time to see an impact. We can't do things for a day or a week to see a change. Time refers to the program or innovation taking place for a long enough time to expect a measurable result. Density is about scale. Are we doing this new thing with enough people to get meaningful data and to say something about what's working? Density refers to the program or innovation happening with enough people and sites to expect a measurable result. And quality. Are we doing the program or innovation with enough quality and consistency in delivery that we can really connect what we're doing day to day with outcomes? Fidelity is reached when you meet all 3 of these components. Skip any one of them and you won't reach fidelity. So for each new implementation effort, we need to ask, how long will this take? How many people will we need to do the work with? And how will we know that we're doing it well? Let's think through a few examples of how fidelity can impact outcomes by looking at time, density, and quality when implementing a new gym routine. Meet Gym Gal 1 and Gym Gal 2. Like many of us, Gym Gal 1 and Gym Gal 2 are thinking about implementing a new healthy lifestyle by starting a new gym routine. Research suggests that you need to work out at least 30 minutes a day, at least 3 to 5 days a week, and both gym gals set off determined to work out for at least 40 minutes, 3 to 5 times a week. With this routine and a certain quality of exertion and workout, over enough time, they should both see results or the outcomes that they expect. Now, what happens if Gym Gal 2 only hits the gym for 5 minutes instead of 40 minutes? Even if she's hitting her max heart rate 80% of the time and going 3 to 5 days a week, should she expect to see results? Now let's say Gym Gal 2 decides to tweak with density. She's back to 40-minute gym sessions, but only makes it to the gym 3 to 5 days a month instead of 3 to 5 days a week. Should she expect to see the outcomes that she's set out to achieve? Probably not. But what about Gym Gal 1? She's sticking to the routine of 40 minutes, 3 to 5 days a week. But while it seems Gym Gal 1 is sticking to the protocol, she hasn't done much work on her mindset and sort of just dials it in when she goes to the gym. Instead of taking the class that gives her feedback and ensures that she stays in her max heart rate zone for the right amount of time, she just hops on a stationary bike while watching TV. When she hits 40 minutes, she hardly broke a sweat and jumps off the bike to head back to work. So as it relates to time and density, technically Gym Gal 1 is meeting the minimum. But in terms of quality, is she implementing her gym regimen as intended and required to see outcomes? Is she pushing herself and getting feedback on her performance, or just staying inside of her comfort zone? Based on what we know about fidelity, did Gym Gal 1 receive measurable results? Unfortunately, the answer here is no. This gym gal was me, and it wasn't until I worked on the quality of my workouts that I saw any results. And what was interesting was that after 49 days, I was quick to blame the bike itself instead of myself for the failure. Consider how that plays out with programs or practices. When we implement something but aren't intentional about fidelity, It's easy to blame the program or practice itself instead of the things that we are doing for poor outcomes. All you have to do is look back through history, and you'll see that the innovations have a tendency to be cyclical, meaning that things are tried, they fizzle and fade, only to reemerge years later. This is likely the result of the program or practice being a good, well intentioned innovation, but not being implemented well, so it never gets its intended results. If you're trying something new, a policy, a procedure, a program, leadership needs to be intentionally noticing fidelity to ensure that things are happening as intended, to be able to see if what you're doing has a meaningful impact and if what you're doing is actually connected to the outcomes. Typically, we implement new programs and policies because we believe that they will provide a service that can help others. Whether they're based on evidence, a best practice, a particular model, data, or our best intentions, we design and implement programs and strategies to look and be experienced in a particular way. Fidelity is a process of measuring how our programs and services are being delivered so that we know whether they're being implemented and performed as intended. Too often, we make assumptions about whether things are working and if they're being delivered as intended. Those assumptions can drive program decisions that you're making based on concrete data about program delivery and impact. Implementation science supports the work of people with innovative ideas to realize socially significant outcomes. This requires a clear model where people benefit from high fidelity use of the innovation. Fidelity starts with being clear about what it is that we are actually implementing and being able to translate this across an organization. Developing your own fidelity measurement tool can help you to be certain that programs and services are being delivered the way that you intended. In order for this to happen, innovations must be operationalized so that they're teachable, learnable, doable, accessible, and scalable in practice. Getting clear and defining the innovation model is the first step. This process includes collective understanding of 1, having a clear program model, or being able to define and communicate what it is that we are asking people to do and why. 2, having a clear description of the essential functions that define the innovation, or what daily activities have to happen to be able to say that the innovation exists in practice. 3, identifying the core activities that allow an innovation to be teachable, learnable, and doable in practice, and promote consistency at the level of actual service delivery. And 4, measurement, or a practical assessment of the performance of providers who are using the innovation for learning and feedback. The data dynamic is a crucial implementation component, and the benefit of looking at the 3 elements of fidelity are many. It can help build your program model and non-negotiables so that you know where to focus, what questions to ask, and where to put your resources. Using fidelity tools can help support staff development, so that way they know what the most impactful practices and elements of their work are, and align staff training with the skills needed to do the implementation. Fidelity tools can also guide what you measure so that you can implement well, track adherence to core components, quickly improve quality, and eventually grow and replicate. It cannot be stressed enough that you need a way to collect, store, and analyze all of this important data. A data system that will help you paint a picture of what's really happening in your organization. What you measure matters. We'll also be sharing a tool with you to help you measure your implementation progress, so more to come there. There are a few framing questions to ask yourself to help you get started on developing your own implementation capacity around the data dynamic. What data do you currently have that could serve as a baseline? Are we documenting and measuring what we're actually doing? What does success look like? How is quality defined, and what does it look like in practice? How will you measure frequency or dosage? How will we know if our efforts are working? And what are some signs that we will see that things are moving in the right direction? What can we do to post-measure our efforts? How long will we collect data before we make changes to the process? Who will be responsible for tracking the data and how? And last but not least, how will we share data in a meaningful way? We'll revisit some of these at the end of the webinar, but for now, let's move on to the next implementation dynamic. The next implementation dynamic is organizational culture. When we talk about culture, we're referring to the behavioral norms and expectations that exist within an organization. This includes its personality, its habits, its values, its boundaries, and even its feel. This is commonly described as the way things are done around here. Organizational culture directly impacts the choices that an organization is willing to make to bring people, processes, and policies in line with implementation strategy. Organizational culture is often invisible to the people on the inside and can be a powerful driver in implementation progress or lack thereof. If you have an amazing strategy and nothing seems to gain traction, you probably have a culture challenge, and this is because culture is always upstream from strategy. Organizational culture is possibly the most important of the implementation dynamics. It requires us to step back and ask ourselves, to what degree is our organizational culture aligned with the innovation itself, to change in general, and to effective implementation strategies? When people, processes, policies, and hidden attitudes, norms, and habits are not aligned with implementation goals, this typically indicates a culture challenge. Let's take a look at organizational culture as an equation. Organizational culture is inputs, or people, habits, and the rules, plus the mindset of those people, or their beliefs, attitudes, and values, raised to the power of dialogue and interaction. The equation highlights the importance of the people within an organization and how their mindsets as well as their habits become what's talked about, and creates models of interaction that recreate and reinforce organizational culture every day, all day long. Think about what people talk about in the break room. This dialogue and interaction can quickly shape the habits and mindsets of employees and becomes how it is around here. Many habits and mindsets support an implementation effort and are likely exhibited by the champions of the initiative or the innovation. Unfortunately, fear, uncertainty, and resistance are powerful emotions that are contagious. These types of mindsets are easily able to permeate a culture and can often transmit deeper and faster across an organization. Organizational habits also go a long way to support the mindsets that people have. If an individual is used to doing work in a particular way, proposed changes might trigger feelings of loss and questions of competency, causing them to hold more strongly to the status quo. Irrelevance is the number one shame trigger in the workplace and is brought on by the fear of the unknown and can quickly transform into a disengaged workforce. This equation also sheds light on perhaps the most important tool for culture change, which is dialogue. If you're not talking about your organizational culture and doing something on purpose to create it, it's happening anyway and may be getting in the way of your implementation. This is why a culture change best practice is overt, ongoing, and candid dialogue in hallways, break rooms, coaching sessions, meetings, and new hire interviews about your current and desired culture. This is how you model, co-create, and reinforce your desired culture, with an intentional change in the language that you use and in the conversations you engage in day to day. For example, take a step back and think for a minute about your current organizational culture. Imagine the words risk, failure, or trial and error. Are those words welcome or supported in terms of your culture, or are they forbidden and evoke fear or discomfort? Are those words threatening or inviting? It's hard to ask employees to take risks, stretch outside of their comfort zones, and try new things when it comes to implementing, if there's a culture that makes risk-taking, failure, and trial and error feel unsafe and or unsupported. The organizational culture dynamic is a lens into the collective mindset of your organization. Organizational culture work means making culture visible and not letting it take over your implementation or derail your efforts. Some organizational culture types are more adaptive collaborative, and agile, making them better equipped at implementing new things. Other organizational culture types have structures and attitudes that slow down or even resist change efforts with cumbersome rules, policies, and bureaucracies. Because of this, the first step in understanding the culture dynamic and to support implementation success is to assess and identify your organization's current culture and your desired state. This helps leaders become intentional on the types of dialogue, behaviors, and attitudes they have to model to begin a meaningful culture shift. By purposely embracing characteristics that align with successful implementation, organizations can shift their culture to support their vision for the future. This takes an honest self-assessment, asking, what is our current culture and how aligned is our culture with where we're going in the future? What needs to change in order to shift to a culture that's more hospitable to change? How will we know if the culture starts shifting? How can we set the tone for this work? And what will we all say specifically? What are our expectations or our beliefs, attitudes, habits, dialogue, and interaction for ourselves and each other? And how will staff be recognized and incentivized for engaging in this work? These are all helpful questions to help you get started with developing your own implementation capacity around the culture dynamic. Consider discussing these questions with your team to get a deeper understanding of how your organizational culture may be helping or hindering your implementation efforts. Leadership is the next implementation dynamic. Leadership attitudes and strategies are often what makes the difference in performance outcomes. This is because leaders are responsible for the important decisions, resources, and strategic relationships often critical to implementation success. Most importantly, leaders set the vision for the new project and communicate how it fits with larger organizational goals. Where they focus their attention, energy, and resources can create a supportive environment for staff, encourage problem solving, and help to remove implementation barriers. The actions and attitudes of leaders impact organizational culture. Attention to purposeful feedback and process improvement may create a learning culture that supports intentional implementation and systematic change. It's easy to get caught in the day-to-day operations of running an organization, putting out fires and problem solving focused on program and service matters. We call this working in the organization. Implementation leadership requires the investment of time, energy, and attention to organizational capacity, working on the organization, and supporting the organizational infrastructure that supports the implementation itself. Change leadership is hard. When the rubber hits the road and you start implementing things, it gets really tough. You meet resistance. Things don't work the way that you expect them to. People move on to other priorities. And leaders have to hold the space and play the long game to see eventual results, even though we might be tired and discouraged. The leadership mindset is contagious, and the leader is the contagion. As leaders, many of us are taught to manage change as if it were something that we could control and govern with management practices. This strategy leads to technical, linear, and check-the-box approaches to the change process that, at best, are limited in their ability to facilitate organizational change and, at worst, create more challenges in the future. Consider the tendency that some leaders have in complex spaces to solve problems with rules and policies. This may work with technical challenges, but with adaptive challenges, it's rare that a new policy, procedure, or set of rules creates meaningful and sustainable change within an organization. Implementation leadership requires a personal and collective commitment to perpetual growth and learning throughout the implementation process. You may have heard this quote by Simon Sinek before, that leadership requires a vision of the world that does not yet exist and the ability to communicate it. This compels us to think about how we lead change and how we know that we're making the difference we intend. The leadership dynamic requires that we as leaders use a mirror and look inward at the way we communicate change, our vision for organizational excellence, and how we show up in that work. A leader's emotional style drives others' moods and behaviors through a neurological process known as the mood contagion. And this travels through an organization like electricity over a network of wires. If you've ever walked into a room before and picked up on a vibe, this is the type of contagion that we're talking about. Leadership is responsible for working both in the organization, doing things like hiring and onboarding, facilitating staff meetings, or even budgeting, to name a few tasks, while also simultaneously working on the organization by intentionally creating a vision for the future, actively seeking feedback to challenge assumptions, and influencing and aligning culture and implementation barriers that come with any implementation effort. Leadership has to play the long game and hold the belief that change is perpetual as opposed to terminal. When we approach change with a finite mindset, we focus on checking the box and moving on to the next best thing. When we approach change with an infinite mindset, we focus on continuous improvement, grounded firmly in the purpose of what we're doing, and are constantly striving for greatness. Great leaders know that Murphy hates us, and what can go wrong will go wrong. So they build failure into their implementation strategies and timelines. When you plan to fail, you lessen the frustration for staff. Thus, your responses are more fluid and adaptable. We model for our teams that experiencing failure does not equate to being a failure. And by embracing trial and error, we acknowledge that learning something new generally precedes a failed attempt to try and do something differently. Here are a few framing questions to get started with developing your own implementation capacity around the leadership dynamic. What is your vision for the future of your organization? And how does this implementation work fit with that vision? How am I showing up for staff? And how do I know? What feedback could I collect that helps me understand how staff experience me? What existing policies, processes, and practices are aligned or misaligned with the work that we're doing? How can we stop or deprioritize the things that are misaligned? What policies, processes, and practices do we need to support this work? And how can we create a foundation for the work ahead? Last but not least, what will I do as a leader of change to build my bench to support this work beyond my tenure? Feedback is the final dynamic for effective implementation. Feedback is how we create an infrastructure to seek out and share information as it relates to people, leadership, data, and culture considerations in implementation efforts. Creating implementation teams can support implementation progress and ensure that feedback loops include people at all levels of an organization to guide decisions and process improvement strategies. Without formal communication lines that create feedback loops, organizational leaders cannot be sure that what they expect to be happening is actually happening in practice, and that staff know what's expected in the first place. Feedback helps leaders determine what is actually being implemented. Feedback is about talking to those doing the work, impacted by the changes, and receiving the innovation to better understand the impact and challenges. Feedback from multiple levels, perspectives, and stakeholders helps us to check our assumptions about what is or isn't working, what our data means and what it's telling us, and how people are experiencing the change. It's not uncommon for leadership to overestimate the amount of meaningful feedback that they're receiving. Without consistent and intentional effort, leaders can become insulated from the type of feedback that leads to learning and improvement cycles. Because implementation science presumes that strategies will change, focused feedback loops ensures that progress is measured and strategies are improved upon, focusing specifically on improvement cycles as a means of refining interventions based on feedback. This process of communicating feedback between staff delivering the programs, leaders making decisions about programs, participants receiving programs, and stakeholders impacted by programs helps to close the policy and practice gap, where practice informs policy and policy supports practice. Incorporating feedback into daily practice is what makes an organization a learning organization. Feedback can come from many places, from participants, assessments, staff surveys, from training and coaching evaluations, fidelity tools, and program data. Feedback provides new knowledge about the work that we do. Feedback asks, how are the people delivering and receiving the innovation being impacted? Is what we're doing helpful and making a difference? What's working? What are we missing? And what might be some unintentional outcomes of our efforts? All of which can support implementation teams, leadership, and organizations to continuously improve. Implementation teams are a science-driven approach to implementation, improving the likelihood that programs and innovations get fully implemented to begin with. The research is clear. Implementation efforts without teams only reach full implementation 14% of the time over 17 years. Whereas implementation efforts with teams reach full implementation 80% of the time in only 3 years. Implementation teams can help an organization create an infrastructure to implement any new idea on purpose, with a focus on results. Implementation teams leverage ideas, expertise, and multiple perspectives to distribute the work of implementation across an organization, not just landing squarely on the leader. Implementation teams can help leaders navigate the complexity of implementation and expand the voices and perspectives to solve problems and improve outcomes. It's not uncommon to get started with implementation and move on to the next effort without checking in with people impacted to see what's working, what are the challenges, and what needs to be fixed and improved upon. The most important element of an implementation team is to create feedback loops between leadership and staff in order to share valuable information about how things are really going at the practice level, and sharing information both up to leadership and downward from leadership to staff. Failing forward and learning from trial and error is a foundational concept of quality improvement. It's not enough to simply put things in place. You must look for opportunities to get good information on how things are working in practice and what adjustments could augment the impact. To do this requires feedback. Implementation teams are made up of staff and stakeholders that are motivated, knowledgeable, and empowered by leadership to work on implementation activities. Using formal and informal feedback loops, implementation teams get crucial data which can help. Some of the work includes activities in the areas of support, measurement, problem solving, and communication. They include identifying barriers experienced by staff and building support systems, coordinating training and practice opportunities to build staff capacity and needed skills, paying attention to staff engagement in the implementation process, tracking the actual progress of the implementation itself, providing a structure to quickly anticipate, identify, and solve problems as they emerge, addressing larger organizational policies and practices that may conflict with a new initiative, prioritizing operations and managing the pace of change, advising leadership on what to stop doing to make room for the new practices, and to communicate important messages in support of the new innovation across the organization. Formalizing feedback loops is also an important step for organizational leaders to become aware of who they seek out, who they listen to, and who they avoid when it comes to decision-making. We know from affinity bias research that unless we're doing something on purpose to reveal and outsmart our instincts, we typically seek out people who look, think, and act as we do. If we want our implementation teams to achieve socially significant and transformational outcomes, we must step out of the comfortable zone and engage with those who have different perspectives. Developing diverse implementation teams engaged in expanding feedback loops can ask important questions to broaden thinking, including asking, who has another view of this? Whose voice is missing? And who has more information? As with each of the other dynamics, here are a handful of framing questions to use to get started with developing implementation capacity around the feedback dynamic. How are the people receiving the innovation or services being impacted as a result of this implementation effort? What feedback would help us to know if how we're showing up at work is helping or hurting? Are we making the difference that we intended? What would be helpful to know from new staff, taking advantage of their fresh perspective? And whose perspective might be missing? Are staff receiving the support and feedback they need to understand their impact? Who is on our implementation team, seeking out intentional feedback that drives process improvement cycles? And last but certainly not least, who are we sharing feedback with to help our decision making process? We encourage you to utilize these discussion questions with your implementation team to strengthen opportunities to elicit and integrate feedback into your implementation strategy. We know a lot about what works to best serve individuals, families, and communities. But understanding what works is only part of the formula that leads to socially significant outcomes for people. The often neglected aspects of creating real system change are in how policies, programs, and practices are implemented. This means being purposeful and intentional, implementing in a way that addresses the 5 dynamics of effective implementation: people, data, culture, leadership, and feedback, and creating a context that supports the change over time. Without focusing on implementation, most change efforts and initiatives are destined to fizzle, fade, or be placed on a shelf only to be dusted off and tried again a few years later. The 5 dynamics of effective implementation is the first tool to guide your intentional implementation efforts. We hope that you'll continue to engage with ACJI's additional implementation tools in each of these 5 dynamics to support your team in effectively implementing innovations. Scientific and strategic implementation work requires formal tools and structured interventions to guide staff about how to do what we're asking them to do. Without tools, people are relegated to their best guesses and their own agendas, which can work against guided and active implementation. These tools and implementation activities are, in and of themselves, interventions for implementation. They're designed to prime leadership, to signal priorities to staff, and to develop language to inform and create applied implementation habits at work. In a moment, once we've finished here, and knowing what you know now, reflect on one thing that you would like to bring forward in your work from the 5 dynamics of effective implementation. Thanks for tuning in to the Dynamic Implementation webinar. Take care.